What does hard mean in the U.S. surgical years?
If you were going to fail, you'd fail quick, but you execute. If you're in marketing, you execute. If you're in sales, you deliver. It's not a place where it suffers fools, and it's not a place where mediocrity can hide. And Mr. Hirsch always would let you fail quickly, but he would never suffer fools. I don't believe in teams because people can hide in a team. He said, I believe in the power of the individual to deliver and execute. There's 10 techniques: create enthusiasm, effectively probe, listen, control, you appeal, features and benefits, maintain control, reasons why, overcome objections, image and stories, and then close. And if they fail the test, they would have to go home. Think about that. Hey, honey, hey, you're back from training soon. Oh, I failed. You mean if you lost your job? Yeah, I lost my job. I failed. If you invest in your weaknesses, you're striving to become mediocre. But if you just say, look, I'm going to focus on my strengths and I'm going to do what no one else can do, then you can maintain and you can go. Isn't that like the best, like diverse euphoria? Because there's no judgment on who you are. There's a judgment on what you do.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Very excited for our guest today. We had some technical issues, but you know what? We made it work. We're recording this on Zoom, so we're going to make this work. That's Joe DeVivo, who's the president, CEO, and chairman of the board over at Butterfly Network. Joe, thanks so much for joining the show. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. MedTech is a really small world, and so there's some prolific names I always hear about. Yours is one of them. So it's been this meeting and us connecting has been a long time coming. I had JJ Desai on earlier, who's Chief Strategic Innovation Officer over at Insight. Spoke really highly of you, and so it's just great to get connected with people like you in our industry.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing. And I have to say, coming from the U.S. surgical roots, I feel indebted to you for being so kind in chronicling our founder and studying a bit of how everything worked there. And so for people like myself who doctors go through a residency, and that residency is when they establish their mentors, their way of doing things. Like if you went to Duke versus Cleveland Clinic versus Stanford, you always have that residency is how you identify yourself, right? U.S. Surgical was my residency. And for so many people who went through surgical, it's formed them for the rest of their careers. And so, when you have someone like yourself taking the time to honor our founder and honor the business, I feel like I'm in your debt.
Man, let me tell you, you paid me the highest compliment, and I think you might be the first person to actually understand what I'm doing here, because for me, father was a surgeon. I went to medical school down in Texas. I did not finish medical school. I dropped out. But, I studied medical history and took it to heart as to why do we do things a certain way as surgeons, right? And so when I entered the med device world, I couldn't unlearn that. And so there's a part of me where I was deeply interested. I guess my residency was technically Missouri Robotics, and I worked with people like Chris Sells, Tim Morowski, Chris Prentice. And so I wanted to learn, where did my mentors get trained? Who are their mentors? Why do we do certain things? Why is it called a razor blade model? Why do we sell this way versus that way? And, over the last 12-ish years of my career, I just noticed that my peer group and the people younger than me didn't have that same appreciation, or at least didn't have that access. And so I said, somebody needs to collect these stories and make them available so that we know where we're coming from, and then we continue to iterate. I think part of the reason why I started the podcast, aside from highlighting great stories, great clinicians and patients in our industry, is out of frustration, Joe. And this is the more of a Joe Rogan-esque podcast, so you can say whatever you want. But, when I work with people who came out of U.S. Surgical, they're cut from a different type of cloth. And when I went to work for other organizations expecting that same level, same caliber of performance, I did not see it. And so as a result, I was very frustrated. I said, I need these people in my generation and younger to understand, what does it mean to be a, medical salesperson? What does it mean to be a MedTech exec? So I appreciate you you're very busy and you're running a major MedTech company. So I appreciate that you spend time on a Friday to come on the show. And after all the AV issues,
Victor, come on. Well, it's you, so I'm really appreciative to be here. I think the honor is all mine.
Absolutely. Well, let's get started with the first question, which is like, how the hell did this happen? And I'm gonna share my screen and take us a little bit back in time here.
Victor,
Um,
Victor, Victor.
so I made this post on LinkedIn after I found somewhere online this photo of U.S. Surgical alum, and I'm like, oh man! And after I recorded the Leon Hirsch episode, I was like, I'm chronicling like the early years of Intuitive, but what people don't realize is that parent of those Intuitive years is really what was done at U.S. Surgical. And so I can't seem to zoom in more, but here you are, right here in the back,
Yep.
right behind, I believe that's Carlos Spabini, right?
Yeah.
Victor,
Yeah. And then his wife, Christine, right next to him to his right. And
Yeah,
then you have
Victor,
Chuck Vivian behind him.
there's Chuck.
Victor,
Yeah,
That's
Victor.
Chuck. And then you got Larry Heaton behind me
yeah,
to the right of my head if you're just looking at the
right,
photo.
right
That's
here.
Larry
Yeah,
Heaton right there. He was president for a while. And then I don't know forget the tall gentleman to the right of Larry, but there's Will Rattan to the right of him by the wall back there. And then the bigger guy with the big guy, Joe Sapienti to the right of Will. And then up front, Rick Granger, Lou Mazzarese. It's just all legends. These guys, it was a hard place to work.
let's
Um,
start there. Yeah, tell me exactly how hard it was to work there. What is that? What does hard mean in the U.S. surgical years?
there's no place to hide. You go into a big company, you can hide into this bureaucracy. You can hide into this department. You're wearing it. It was not a place. It was a place that set a very high bar, was going to execute on very aggressive R&D programs, solving big problems. So if you were going to fail, you'd fail quick, but you execute. If you're in marketing, you execute. If you're in sales, you deliver. It's not a place where it suffers fools, and it's not a place where mediocrity can hide. And so the people who succeeded there were just awesome. And they were characters too, because these are, very unique people with just, confidence and charisma and capability. I was in awe working there. I looked to my left, like Carlos Babini is just, I mean, just excellence exemplified. The man, everything he did was polished and perfect and prepared and well thought through. And he had such a passion and such an excellence. And, not in that picture, Bob Canar ran all of sales and all commercial. Unbelievable, man. Unbelievable. And of course, Mr. Hirsch, sets that tone. It's a place where they went through a lot of people, because if you couldn't, again, there's no place to hide. You deliver on what you have to deliver. If you fail, okay, it's fine to fail, but it's not fine to not do your job. And Mr. Hirsch always would let you fail quickly, but he would never suffer fools. And so all the people in every department, whether it was operations, manufacturing, procurement, legal, regulatory, PQA, marketing, sales, you're walking amongst just exceptional people, because we're competing against J&J. J&J, had all the money in the world, all the money, all the resource, all the time, and we are just moving this. This is Mr. Hirsch. Tempo. His word was tempo. He wanted to see things move. Average company would launch products in 24 to 36 months. We were out there 12 to 18. We moved. And he was very hands-on. He wanted to see everything. But what was also amazing about him was, there wasn't a lot of bureaucracy. I remember one day he had fired a VP of marketing, and I was in an advanced technology group, and there was only 4 of us in this one group. And the VP of marketing had this advanced technology group, then had all these marketing departments and all these other resources. But we happened to report to this VP of marketing because he was in the midst of hiring someone to run advanced technology. So now the 4 of us are reporting directly to Mr. Hirsch temporarily until he goes through the next transitions. And he said something really profound. He said, I don't believe in teams because people can hide in a team. He said, I believe in the power of the individual to deliver and execute. And so he always wanted to put people in a situation where that person had the leeway, the runway, the empowerment to succeed. If it was a group and they're hemming and hawing, he would rather, and so he just said, you're in your position for a reason. Do what you need to do and execute, and come see me if you ever need me. And in that environment, you leave yourself vulnerable for a person to make a mistake. And so if they do something that proves they're not worthy of the job, then they're not there anymore. But if you do it and you succeed, and then the trust and the empowerment and the velocity, it's just, I've not experienced anything like that. I mean, you see it in startup companies, where you have to, in a small organization where, you have a small group and there's no bureaucracy, but you don't see it in a large company like this. And so I look at the days, I look at those pictures, and I smile, because every single one of those people, plus all the people that weren't there, but they're just exceptional.
If you're a CEO of a MedTech company and you just got ghosted by another investor this week, or maybe a strategic that you're trying to have a meeting with just kind of brushed you off at a conference, and you're just sick and tired of all this, you want to make these people pretty much eat their words, right? I think I have something for you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most MedTech startups don't fail because of product. And trust me, I can confidently say this after interviewing so many different startups on the show, investors, strategics. A lot of them fail because the market never really formed around them. My obsession with technology adoption, and more importantly, market engineering, has sort of taken shape over the years into my business called MarketCraft, and recruiting a top tier team around me for that. And MarketCraft, we're not just about digital marketing and campaigns and everything. We focus on engineering markets. We use AI trained models, psychology, persuasion, and strategic storytelling to manufacture something that every single CEO needs, and that's leverage. We want to give you leverage with the market, so by creating magnetic messaging and attention, we can shape a belief system that is going to attract and magnetize those early clinical adopters to you. We want to give you leverage with investors, because when your category narrative is very clear and your demand signals are loud, and you can show this early clinical pipeline, and then at that point, capital start to chase you instead of the other way around. Now you have options. And then leverage with strategics. Because look, when you show a strategic, and trust me, I've had many conversations with them on this podcast and offline. When you show them that you're starting to own momentum in a space that they care about, you don't just look like a startup to them anymore. Now you look more like a partner. And if you do it really well, potentially competition they need to take out, right? So if you're an early stage MedTech CEO and this all resonated with you, I want you to stop what you're doing, put pause on this podcast, go to growmymedtech.com. That's GROW, growmymedtech.com. I want you to book time with me. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of a market analysis for you. I'm going to come to the table with 2 to 3 really good ideas. There's not a guarantee that you guys might be a fit for us. It could be the wrong time, a lot of things like that. We turn away more companies than we take on. But I can guarantee you that you're going to walk away with 2 or 3 really good ideas for free, and it's going to be a good conversation. So go to growmymedtech.com. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. And more importantly, you can feel free to vent to me about all the problems that you're having, because at MarketCraft, we want to come and solve those for you immediately. Now, let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, you see it throughout our industry, because a lot of the most well-known leaders and names, in our industry, sort of the coaching tree or bloodline goes back to U.S. Surgical.
Well, yeah, you bring up Intuitive, so Jerry McNamara was
That's the name I was going to bring
Surgical.
up. Yeah,
Jerry was a killer. I mean, Jerry was the best of the best, and he was just a killer. And he knew the one of the things I learned at Surgical was, marketing is very much a science, and you learn all these techniques in marketing. But people think that sales is about personality. Sales is as much a process and as much a discipline and as much a science as everything else, because it's about human behavior. And so Jerry McNamara was incredible. And he, when he went to Intuitive, he just brought so much of that core selling, capability. And then if you didn't have the ability to do the job, then you would be very quickly called out. That's how you keep that high performance. And so then he brought over Alex Sukic, which was another hero at US Surgical, strategic guy, someone who knew, M&A strategy, then, Carlos's brother, Christian, and then, Henry Charlton, who's still there. Henry used to work for me. His first job at Surgical was working for me as a sales rep, and now he's running the entire commercial organization today at Intuitive. Just great, great, great people.
Henry's been somebody that, I've been in touch with, and so we're trying to get him on the show. He's been busy. You said his name before I did, so I'll say I'll say a few words about you. So I'm very grateful to get, after so many years, for me, one of my mentors, when you were at US Surgical, I would imagine you interacted with Chris Sells.
Yes.
Chris was a very close friend, mentor to me. And so, so I was familiar with Jerry. And so I finally connected with Jerry about a year or two ago. And have been fortunate enough to, be able to like pick up the phone and call him just for advice and feedback and stuff. But I will say the first time I talked to Jerry, I can't remember a time. I think maybe it was my medical school interview where I was putting so much focus on energy on every word I was using to communicate. Because I'll tell you, like, and I remember like I had a great conversation. He was very kind, very, very helpful to me and everything. But I remember when I hung up the phone, I was like, man, that kind of tells you the influence that somebody has when I never worked for this guy, nor do I report to him. But I was still like on point when I was having a conversation with him.
Yeah, that's the kind of guy he is, and that's not by chance. I mean, he's so smart, and he knows exactly what you're saying, and he knows if you're not
There's
on
no
point.
hiding.
There's none. Oh, no.
That's what it is. Can't like mess around or
Right.
or BS. No, and something you said before, which I think this is where because I think part of these interviews is that it's a bit of self-discovery for me as to like why I'm doing this. And I think like you said that sales is very much about a science and about behavior change. And for me, sales is all a process, not a singular event. And I think there was a certain point in my career, Joe, where what I had learned from people out of US Surgical, people like Sells and I know Christian Pavini and everything was one thing. And then what I was seeing in the field was like something else. Like it was almost like sinful, like just kind of like almost like a bastardizing of what I was taught and what I knew what sales to be. For me, there's a certain level of discipline and caliber that comes with being a medical salesperson, being on top of it.
Yeah.
That I don't see as often these days with these younger reps, so, and just like a completely like quick sidebar, like as an example, I have a medical sales program that teaches people how to like sell and persuade using social media and digital if you can't see them in person. This rep reaches out and he's like, yeah, I'm not doing as well as I want. And like I was in the OR and this happened. And the first question I asked him, I was like, Graham, like, how well do you know your procedure guide? And he's like, well, I know it pretty well. I was like, how many Met pages? He's like, it's about 250. I'm like, great. I'm like, do you have it like memorized backwards and forwards? Like if I asked you for like a page, like, do you know it? And he's like, maybe not that well. I'm like, okay. So why don't you tell me about the doctor you called on? I was like, did you read the last like 5 publications they wrote? He's like, well, I read like 2 of them. I'm like, okay. I was like, does this sound like you're being thorough in what you're doing? And so like this is essentially how I want to say, quote unquote, raised in this culture of medical sales. And this is why like I get excited talking to you because this is something that needs to be perpetuated and amplified and not sort of gone away. Because let's face it, for better, or for worse, the way that people were managed, back in the US surgical years and the intuitive years in the 2000s, you can't do that anymore. But that doesn't mean that the discipline and the rigor needs to go away and things need to get soft,
So it's 100%. And that's one of the things that, I heard, very much, and what I lived at Surgical was discipline. In order, the sales process wasn't, we were going into the operating room. We were trained in our training program to scrub and scrub in. And so we would have in our surgical training program, it was 1/3 anatomy physiology. So there was, you're in a classroom learning. It's 1/3 sales pitches and salesmanship. And then it's 1/3 in a clinical setting in a laboratory. We go into a lab. And every day we were evaluated on the 10 techniques of selling. There's 10 techniques. And those techniques are create enthusiasm, effectively probe, listen, control, you appeal, features and benefits, maintain control, reasons why, overcome objections, image and stories, and then close. And so those 10 techniques governed how we would go in our days. And every day through a 6-week training program that was every single day now, in a hotel 7 days a week for 6 straight weeks, never leaving the hotel. You immerse yourself significantly. And then everything that you do in a sales pitch, you're evaluated 1 to 10 on those 10 techniques, and you get a grade from 1 to 100 every single day. And you were required to memorize clinical pitches verbatim. Why? Because and you'd sit there and say, I don't need to memorize this damn sales pitch. Well, I know how to sell something. I don't need to memorize word for word this pitch. And it's like, well, you have this attitude thinking that, this is silly, this is beneath you, but they force you to memorize. They force you to go through and understand the pros, especially if you're at the OR table and the doctor's using an instrument and you're doing a clinical pitch. And they say, take the device, open the handle, place the jaws around the tissue, make sure there's no extraneous tissue above and below, depress the handle, and then, remove the safety, and then with both fingers, compress and fire. Like these were like literally verbatim pitches. And why? Why did you need a verbatim pitch? Because you know what? When you're sitting there in the operating room and the doctor looks at you, let me tell you something, your knees get weak. You start to get sweaty. It's like, holy cow, am I really here in this room? Is this person looking at me and asking me, if you're in that situation, of course, they don't ask you all day long. Doctors know what they're doing. You train them beforehand. But there are situations where they will look at you as an expert. And when you're nervous, you sit back and you hold on to that verbatim like a crutch, because it's like back there, and it all of a sudden just comes out of your mouth. I can do everything. Salesperson all of a sudden melts away, and you might as well just be sitting there reading your clinical pitch. The discipline to force people to do that. And then our training program, we would get something called Tab A. And Tab A was 200 pages of anatomy and physiology that you had to memorize before the first day of training. When you came into training on that first day, you were tested. And I was in 60 people were in my training class, 30 international, 30 US, just about. And you were only allowed to fail once. And fail meant you had to get more than a 90 on your entrance exam. And so you got in on a Friday, anyone who didn't get over a 90 had to retake the test on Monday. But now Saturday, you started your training. So now we're consuming new content on Saturday and on Sunday. And so those people had to learn the content Saturday and Sunday. They had to then retake the test. And if they failed the test, then they would have to go home. Think about that. Hey, honey, you're back from training soon. Oh, I failed. I mean, like you lost your job? Yeah, I lost my job. I failed. So the pressure is so high. On the first test, you had to have a 90. On the second test, you had to have a 90. On the third test, you had to have a 95. And if you didn't get above a 95, you failed. And there were people who failed. There were people who went home. And that pressure was extraordinary. So, I knew Mr. Hirsch personally when I was a little kid. He was a next door neighbor.
Really?
Yeah. So I was in the garbage industry. My dad made garbage cans in DeVivo Industries in Connecticut. And I'm 12 years old, and the doorbell rings, and there's this little Jewish guy, and my mom's next to me, and we go, hello. And he goes, hi, my name is Leon Hirsch. I own a $50 million company, and I just bought the property behind your house. And we look at him. My mom looks at me, look at him, and we just paused and said, come on in. And from that time, he purchased 100 acres of land behind our home with the intention of purely building world-class trout fishing ponds. There was two like mini pond. I couldn't call them a lake, can't call them a pond, but he just created this trout. Fly fishing was his passion. We would see him come into the property. He'd stop by all the time, and I grew up knowing the man. So I was very fortunate to know the man before I knew the businessman. I understood his love of nature, his peacefulness and kindness. It was wonderful.
That's amazing. I had no idea. This might be the first time in my entire career that I talked to somebody where they had that early of experience in med tech. Did that play a big influence on you deciding to go into medical devices like post college and stuff? Like how did that influence you?
Well, it was the reason. So I had known him, and he had actually brought me to surgical to watch a few meetings and stuff. But I had worked for the family business, and then and I thought that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And in my senior year in college, my mom calls and tells me that she's divorcing my dad, and all hell broke loose. And my dad wanted me to quit college. And so I worked for my family business for 5 years. And it was an absolute, it was a wonderful experience on one side, but it was when you're an only child and your dad is in manufacturing, producing the product, and your mom's in the office doing the books. When there's a divorce, it's really messy. And so I tried to make it work. It didn't work. Mr. Hirsch knew what was going on with my parents. And I went to go see him one day at the office, and he said, "So, Joey, tell me what you did for your father." He'd tell me. And I said, "Well, trying to impress him. You're in a family business. Oh, I used to buy steel. Oh, I used to do the books. Oh, I used to help schedule production. I want to make him think that, I can do anything." And that's the worst thing you can do in that situation, because they want, they're a big company. You want a person that does one thing. And he asked me the question that changed the course of my life, which was, he said, "So Joey, tell me the one thing that you did best for your father." And I said, "Mr. Hirsch, I sold. That's what I did best." Thank God I answered the question that way. He goes, "Okay," like this. We stand up, walk downstairs, walks me right into Charlie Johnson's office. I don't know if you know Charlie Johnson, the total legend. His son, Brian, runs Mass Medic in Boston. That's
Oh
Brian
yeah,
Johnson.
I know what Brian is. Okay.
Yeah. So his father's Charlie. He ran all medical education, used to run Salesforce, built the whole Centers of Excellence program. Nicest guy in the world, smartest guy in the world, sweet, incredible. So Mr. Hirsch walks in Charlie's office and he says, "Hey, Charlie, see if you can find Joey a territory." And I'm like, and Charlie looks at me. He goes, some kid who doesn't know anything selling garbage cans. I talked to him for a bit, and he goes, "Well, how do you like Vermont?" He figured, hey, I could put the kid in Vermont. It's not going to mess anything up there. But what I realized was I thought that was the greatest gift in the world. But what I learned afterwards was Mr. Hirsch, it was the easiest decision for him, because he can just put me in the training program. And if I got through that organ grinder, then I can be in this, then I can, I can succeed in this company. But if I didn't and I failed, then he'd say, "Joey, I gave you a chance. It didn't work." Right. So I'm pretty proud that even though, he got me a job in territory, I took it to heart, and I said, "My God, this guy is giving me a chance." And so I went into that training program, and I worked as hard as I could, and I succeeded.
That's amazing. And I love that, just because I think maybe because of the times we live in, especially with the internet and social media, but I feel like back then, pre-internet, you never took things for granted because you never knew when you're going to see that again. You
Right.
know? And what you share is like, this, I think in some ways, like this is why I like talking to people like you that, lived during those times and grew up in them, because, like for me coming out of medical school, I remember for a full year, I did door-to-door sales trying to break into med device. All these recruiters were like, "Nah, you don't have an experience." gonna have to start out selling band-aids and stuff and disposables. No offense to disposables, by the way. But and no, I remember one recruiter, I can't remember who it was, but he specifically told me, he's like, there's no way on God's green earth any big med device company or a robotics company, let alone, will hire you. And I like
Mhm.
and I fortunately found my way into Missouri Robotics as my first job. But I remember the training was similar to what you just described. You had to, score over 90%. I think the first time I did, I think I scored like an 80, and so I had to retake it, and I got through. But I think that's something that's sometimes people take for granted. And I think people these days, especially again, m- I'm just kind of like ranting on my generation, but I don't think there's anything wrong with being ambitious and having big aspirations, but I think there is something wrong with not being patient.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't
No, I
know.
definitely know what you mean. No, I definitely know. There's this immediate gratification and entitlement. I should get this because that person's gotten that. It was, look, I have 5 kids and I have a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, and I want him to have everything that I've had and want him to grow. But I'm hard on him and I'm hard on my daughter, and I have 3 older sons who are in the workplace and they work their butt off. It's because uh, we tried to make sure that they understood the type of principles, and they also had an example of someone working their butt off. But it's sometimes it's not transferable. But it's
You just do your best. And I'm in no place to give any advice on this because I'm a new father. My
oh,
son's
how
20
old?
months old. He's 20 months old.
Oh,
Um,
congratulations. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. But so, just to share something that, when I met my wife, I was unemployed in between jobs. It was like, so Mazor had just they exited to Medtronic, but I was unemployed. I couldn't find a job. I was living in Orlando. Why my wife met me, and I mean, she saw a lot in me, and one of my biggest supporters, but she gave me the best compliment I've ever received in my life. And this compliment is kind of like a guiding post for like how I want to raise my son and eventually our children. We're aiming to have another hopefully soon. My wife's Turkish. It's a Turkish saying where it said that for a certain type of man, that God can give this man lemons and he'll find a way to support an entire family. And so it's like
Mm,
it's a principle on like hard work,
right.
you know?
Wow.
And you can do the best that you can. And I know some great parents out there who their children didn't end up the way you wanted it. And I know some terrible parents whose children ended up great. So you can just do the best and just, I feel like being parents, like being a coach, that's really the best you can do.
That
But
that is, I mean, like all
yeah,
5 of my kids are different people.
yeah,
They're just different people, and you're just here to help guide them, but they got to be who they are.
Yeah, and for me, if there's one principle that I try and instill in my personal life, instill in people who work for me, and in my son, is just like if you just work hard and you're persistent enough, like I think good things will happen. You know,
hmm
and
Yeah,
I
I
feel
had
like,
heard someone
you know,
say, someone had said, I don't know where I heard this, but if you show up every day and show up on time. If you only do those 3 things in life, you will be successful.
I, I no,
Yeah.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And I think again, like I look at our industry. I want to ask you some specifics about U.S. surgical, but I look at our industry today, and you know, it is hard being a medical salesperson these days. You
It
can't
is
just
very hard
walk.
now.
Yeah, I remember a time when I was 13 years old that I just literally I walk into the hospital, nobody asks me anything. I go back to the OR. I say hi to the front desk, and I don't even say who I am. I just say, "Hey, I'm here to shadow Dr. Khateeb." My dad was a surgeon. I was like, "I'm here to shadow Dr. Khateeb. You guys got some scrubs I can borrow?" And they're like, yeah, yeah, go ahead and just go in the doctor's lounge and I just walk in. You know, those times have changed, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
But that being said, I think the best medical salespeople I've met aren't like geniuses, but they just find a way. They just
Right.
find a way to deliver, like no matter what.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that a successful salesperson has in common is that they know their product, first of all, and they know their product from an extent that they're a value add when people are around them, that they want them around. Because if you're there always to sell and people can tell you're, selling, then they don't want you around. But if you're there because they can benefit from your knowledge and experience and you can be helpful, then they love you. And so a rep who is very knowledgeable on the technology is always welcome. And then second, that rep, if they know the customer well, understand the health system, understand the systems, understand how things work, understands what the doctor, the procedure, and then what they need. It again goes into the formula of delivering value. Because if you're credible, if they want you around, then they'll trust you. And if you've earned that trust, then, and if you don't overstep your bounds, you can create a roadmap for your product and they'll listen to you. So it's some of the people at Surgical were the tallest, best looking, people out there, like Carlos Babini. Okay. Carlos suit, four-masted, pocket square, white teeth, tan, pinstripe, cufflinks. You would think that this guy has no substance whatsoever. You would think that he's just using his charisma. But he only manifests that because, his father was a concert cellist. And he is just someone who exudes excellence. And you look at Carlos, he knew the product better than anybody, period. He knew the customer better than anybody. Customers wanted him around. And it wasn't because he was polished. It was because, or physically polished. It's because he was complete and he was, a value add. And I think people, you got to do your work, Omar. You got to do your work. You got to master your product. You can't be there just to persuade people. You have to add value with people. And I find when you do that, you're most successful.
100%. And I'm so happy you said that because, sometimes we have a huge audience. We got, investors, physicians listen to the show, but of course we have a lot of like young reps. And, the most common thing I get from is like, hey, like, how can I set myself up for success? We have an Instagram channel where I post stories. And so a lot of reps message me. It's like the most common thing, like, how can I be successful in this industry? And the most common, the answer I give, I'm just like, not just work hard, but know your stuff inside and out to the point where I think as a salesperson, you've achieved a certain level of, I want to call it greatness, but you've gone to a certain level when the physician, there's no difference between when they're talking to you versus when they're talking to a peer.
Right.
And you know when that's happening, right? Because you don't have to think hard about the conversation that you're having with them clinically. It just comes naturally. And there's some reps who I've met, like I wish I remember their names. I was on an airplane and I sat next to these two distributors. They were in their like late 40s, early 50s. And I remember talking to them about spine procedures, and they were just talking about the intricacies. And I was listening. I'm like, I was like, these guys are talking the same way that a surgeon would talk. The level of detail that they understand, like including just like the nuance of the procedure is just unbelievable. And that only way that happens is not only just experience, because a lot of people are like, oh, I need more experience. Sometimes the only experience you need is just sitting down your butt every night, every weekend, reading through clinical texts. We have YouTube. There's all these things. You can just immerse yourself in the content and then become your customer. And then magically, they tend to trust you better.
Yeah, I remember selling during the laparoscopic cholecystectomy time whether it's a way of taking out a gallbladder using cameras inside the abdomen. And I would watch people burn the gallbladder off of the bed of the liver. And some people would just, butcher it. Some would be so elegant and do it so quickly. But one of the things that you have as a sales rep is I would see maybe 300 procedures a year. I'm in the OR every morning. I'm going to see one or two a day, and I'm going to see the same procedure done by 20 or 30 different doctors every single day for a year. So after a while, I'm actually kind of an expert in that one little thing on where to put your ports, how to manipulate, how do you lift up the liver, then how do you start? We as sales reps, because we're doing this over and over and over, you understand, and then you start seeing that thing that's so scary about healthcare is the difference in the quality or the difference in the capability of the surgeons. Everyone thinks that you just put a white coat on and that's doctor, but what do you call the person who was last in medical school?
Joe, let's be honest.
And
At this point in your career, for you and for me, we've both encountered surgeons where we would not let them open a can of tomatoes. We don't do like there's been that one. For me, there's like one spine, and I will not mention their name, but the one spine surgeon who I was in a case, and I was like, I wouldn't let this guy open a can of tomatoes.
and ever since having that experience, now any family member, any loved one is going to go through the medical process. You call people and find the best person.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely, but as a rep, probably one of the days I remember that I was so proud was when I got a call from a doctor's secretary saying, "Hey, are you going to be in town on Wednesday? Because he wants you here for a case." And I said, "No, I won't, but I'll be there Thursday." He rescheduled the case for me to be there.
So the first thing I want to know is like, you mentioned about US surgical, like it's not a place you can hide. And that like really hits a tone with me because with the execs that I worked with who came out of US surgical, spent those early years at Intuitive, there was no hiding. You cannot hide, right?
Right.
I want to hear the biggest mistake that you made at US surgical where it was such a painful lesson that it forced you to change and you changed for the better. Does anything stand out to you?
I made a mistake on a product and kind of drove a product to market, and I remember it didn't sell, and it didn't sell. It was pretty bad, and I remember Guy Fiorello, who ran operations, because now all of a sudden he had all this inventory and it wasn't selling, and he had to take a write-off, and it affected his performance. And I just remember, being a little bit too overconfident, a little bit too cocky, asking the wrong people, looking for what I wanted to hear instead of being true to the research. It failed. So that for me was really painful because I had some really big successes with developing the 5 millimeter clip applier, or the reticulating GIA. The first I had a program. No, we used to have a 30, an endo GIA 30, and endo GIA 6. Actually, you probably don't want to hear all this.
No, but my audience does, and I want to hear it too. Please, Joe, continue.
So I had a program where we had the best-selling product in the company was a 30 millimeter linear stapler. It had 3 rows of staplers on either side. It was endoscopic, and you can do like lung volume reductions or a staple across bowel. We then had a 60 centimeter device, and the 60 centimeter device had a cartridge in it because it required so much force to go 6 centimeters with 6 rows of staples with a knife blade that would cut tissue. You didn't have enough force in your hand to compress all of that weight into an anvil. And so they had to have a CO2 cartridge in it. You press it and it would go, and it would form these staples. Well, Ethicon came out with a 45, and it only had 2 rows of staples, and it had a big duck bill, on it. And it was made for, at the time, lung volume reduction was the big procedure. And, they asked me, take this program on, you have to figure out how to do a 45. So we had to sit with the engineers and figure out, well, are we going to take the 30 design and try to make a 45? Or are we going to take the 60 design and try to make a 45 and bring it down? And one day, John Wilson, one of our R&D guys, brilliant guy, worked for Rick Granger. He came in and he had a caulking gun. And so a caulking gun, you have this cylinder, you have this handle, and you have this rod. And as you squeeze the handle, it'll do a click forward. Squeeze it again, a click forward. And that's what the hammer pushes the caulk out of the tube when you're going to caulk. Now, surgical had something called tissue gap control mechanism, which means as the knife blade would travel across the stapler. When you compressed on the tissue, sometimes the stapler wasn't perfectly in line. But when you fired it, there was a sled that connected the blade that all of a sudden would bring it to be perfect. But you would do it in one shot. So what John said was, what if you can get the doctors to squeeze multiple times, then we can, instead of trying to form all those staples in one shot, you can squeeze it and advance the blade to not only cut, but form the staples ahead of the blade. So what it did then was we had an anvil in the 30. It was a cast iron anvil that had to be strong enough to have these staples fire into them. But if we can just move the blade and didn't have to have all this firing force, we didn't have to have this anvil. And if we don't have this anvil, we can just have a regular stainless steel anvil that we can throw away every single time. So it became, because we were moving the device with multiple squeezes, we were able to put a 30, a 45, and a 60 on the same handle, because all it matters was what the length was and how you formed it. And that was probably one of the biggest decisions that we made. And thank God that was the right decision, because today the product line went from being like 55, 60% gross margin to about 70% gross margin. And it was a very, very successful project. And then now they're making it articulate and having all these different sizes. So it was a big franchise for surgical. But after having such confidence in making decisions like that and doing other things, I made a really bad decision on a valve, a heart valve suturing device. And that cost the company a lot of money.
Would you say that the decision you made was it mainly because your ego drove it?
I would say so. I was confident that it would work. We had a product called Endo Stitch that was an incredible device that would pass the needle through the tissue. And so I tried to modify Endo Stitch to be able to place Dacron sutures into a valve deep in the open heart surgery. And the product works, but doctors, like to hand sew. And I listened to a couple doctors, and they told me what I wanted to hear. And it was a big mistake. It didn't work.
Earlier in your career, and sometimes when people make these mistakes, I think we all have, like for me, God knows that there's some very different and new marketing campaigns and strategies that I launched that at the first time didn't work, and they were a big public disaster. It's sometimes really hard to recover from stuff like that. You almost become trigger shy. And luckily, shout out to Joe Urban, who's a CEO I worked with, where one of these things happened, and he came to me and said, "Hey, like, I know that didn't work, but I don't want you to be trigger shy to like avoid trying it again and stuff." But earlier in career, like especially at a place like US Surgical, those conversations post that event weren't so friendly and nice. How did you recover from something like that?
Well, like I mentioned before, we were able to fail quickly. I think I'd built up enough credibility with other things that I'd done. It was just a black mark I had to deal with. But I had enough, I don't know, blue marks or whatever the other color would be that were positive that you just wrote it up to, it was just a mistake. Some people don't survive that. I remember, we had someone who, launched a disposable scope. Great guy, unbelievable marketing guy, but it didn't fly. And he really went for it. He'd have these, we didn't have email at the time. We'd have voicemail. Voicemail was how we communicated. And so you'd listen to all your voicemails, and then he'd put music on in the background, and he was very theatric. His name's Dan Krupp. He's a great guy, but he got put on this program, and, he went for it, and the program ultimately failed, not because of him. He ultimately, took the heat for it. But sometimes it's just luck if you survive those things. And again, that was my big one.
When you think back at the time, so again, like before I ask you this next question, I kind of want to share something with you. I've shared with a few key guests, and I only do this because I feel like I'll talk it into existence. You've seen some movies like Boiler Room or The Wolf of Wall Street, for example, right?
Yep.
There's a part of me where when I started my business, where I want to make more, I want to drive revenue higher, partly just to do things at scale that I want to do. So this podcast is one of those examples. So like my business fully funds this. Unfortunately, I have a great sponsor. Clary's a great sponsor, and we'll get some more. But the other side of it, Joe, is I don't know how or when, but I will find a way to raise money and commission a I don't know if a Martin Scorsese will be one, but like a Martin Scorsese-esque film of like the years of surgical, just between the time, the people that you mentioned, that photo I see and everything. And I just feel like it would be such an unrealistic film to watch. People, it would be so entertaining. I think the general public would love it. And I just want to share, I think I'm one step closer. Do you know Chris Dewey by any chance? So
No.
Chris
That's
Dewey is a investor in the space. He's invested in Procept and Oris and everything. He's from the robotics world. He was one of the founders of Mako. Really amazing guy. You would love him. He was on my show recently. But before he got into MedTech, he was the co-founder of Canon Films. And so he's very good at fundraising, and specifically he knows how to fundraise for movies. So I feel like I need to get to a point. I'm going to call Chris. I'm going to raise the money, and then we will commission a cinematic film of U.S. Surgical. So I just wanted to, I'm just putting that out into the ether to
Well,
hopefully
the
go through.
problem is that people are just going to, a film like that will probably be just focusing on all the negatives because that'll be what's entertaining, you know?
That's
Except unless you commission it independently,
That's
then we can
true.
focus on the real story and not just like, dramatized stuff. But there's going to be some action and some humor. And so that kind of leads me to my next question, which is like, you hear some great stories that are in part hilarious, but just really entertaining, right? Whether it's like somebody, converting a hospital over, or, some interesting incident that happened, or like what are some sort of entertaining stories that come to mind from those times at US Surgical? Things that really
Uh,
that make you smile. Maybe things you haven't talked about, but in that case, we definitely want to hear them.
I remember they had a national sales meeting in Las Vegas, and it was the last year, and they made such a mistake. There was a year when people were killing it. Reps, people were just killing it. And they would bring the reps up on stage and give them their commission checks. And it was the last time at a sales meeting that they ever handed them an actionable check because like a week later, they got all kinds of calls from angry wives. These guys would blow the money in the casinos, at the sales meeting because they would just go, crazy at these sales meetings. And so I think after that, I don't think surgical ever went to Vegas again. And they certainly didn't hand out live checks to people. But there were times when people would win the stock price was going through the roof. People would win awards, and the awards would be like, and they'd price the stock at a certain time and be between the time they priced the stock and the time they gave the certificate. It could be, $100,000. I mean, the thing could have really appreciated. And they'd be like, do you know what's in here? And, Mr. Hirsch and Bob Canar always, was always feed the eagles, starve the turkeys. So and the turkeys didn't last long. You just slaughter them. But boy, those eagles would make some real money. And at the time when you're making that kind of crazy money, people are buying crazy vehicles. The doctors would be so upset because the sales reps would be rolling in with a car that's so much nicer than theirs. So you got to, learn that lesson. But I remember one thing, I was at another national sales meeting. And so you guys don't do this. I'm giving you a pointer right now. We're in the bar and there's like, I don't know, 100 people in the bar before the whole thing starts. And this real junior rep, walks up to the bar and the bartender and he orders a drink. And so like everyone at the bar turns and looks at this guy. When he checked out, he had a $6,000 bar tab.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah.
You don't go into a sales meeting and give your name and room number in front a bunch of, sales, because all of a sudden shots for everybody. Oh, put her on 662. But anyways, that's probably not, what you're looking for.
Oh no, that's definitely no.
Yeah.
Please, more of
Yeah.
that.
There was times when, look, people were just making a lot of money and doing stupid things. It was not, these guys worked so hard and they played hard. They had the watches, they had the cars. It was pretty colorful.
That is amazing. So I want to ask me personally, I'm speaking for myself. We live in a pretty politically correct world these days, and I'm not crazy about it. But I do want to ask a question about this. This is factual, right? But back in those times, right, 80s and 90s, right, a lot of these sales forces, especially in MedTech, it's like predominantly men. However, there were like women sales reps, not a lot of them. But I feel like some of those women who made it in to these quote unquote boys clubs and like made it through were pretty much built from iron. Did you work with any? Did any
Yes.
of them come to mind? And the reason why I mentioned them, okay, and again, this is a very like touchy subject, but this is true, is that on the same token, not so much today, but 10 years ago, I think it was like this. Maybe I think it still is. There are certain surgical specialties that are very, very male dominated. And when you meet a woman who's gone through that specialty, that woman is like not only incredibly charismatic, incredibly intelligent, but she had to go through hell as a woman, right? And they're just like built from steel. And a lot of them, they're mothers, and they do everything, and they're just like superhumans. So I was wondering, like, who comes to mind for that?
And that's a real interesting thing about Mr. Hirsch. Mr. Hirsch loved capable people, loved them, whether it was a man or whether it was a woman. It just didn't matter to him. He was a simple man and he wanted killers. He wanted executors. One was Shelley Spray.
That's the
Um,
name I've heard before. Tell me
she
more.
she was the most talented marketing person I've ever worked with, the most creative, the most dynamic, the most polished. And man, did she take a lot of grief because Mr. Hirsch loved her and she was gorgeous, is gorgeous. She is just like one of those people that got up to do a presentation to whatever she did was it, polished, done, creative. You'd sit there like and so I was in marketing when she was in marketing, and I would just be in awe because she always had the biggest product, the best this and that. And jealous people would be like, oh, Mr. Hirsch likes, pretty girls and this other stuff. You'd hear these horrible, characterizations from what would be a jealous, sexist man, right? So they have to go through a lot of grief that they didn't deserve. But she was a killer. Another one was Lee Cohen, and she was a little bit before my time. And I just, when I was a rep, I knew of her, and she left marketing right when I came in. Actually, my phone extension at US Surgical was 51980, and that was hers. And I was so like when she left and I came in, and I think I even got her office. I was so proud to have her extension, just because I was so in awe of her. She was the one who was in product development, and she was the one who saw the opportunity. So at the time, the first part of US Surgical was surgical stapling, right? So it was bowel stapling, stomach stapling, and the company had built, I don't know, 700 million, $800 million business worldwide on surgical stapling. Lee Cohen saw the market opportunity of laparoscopic surgery. She saw what was happening at the time where the OBGYNs were looking with their, through these tubes and to see what was happening with the ovaries and whatnot. And then they would put these cameras in and they would do these diagnostic laparoscopies. But she saw the opportunity to do a gallbladder. And she convinced Mr. Hirsch to create the automated clip applier because, pushing a clip in and letting the clip fall in the abdomen is a big deal, but having it as a part of a device where you just fire it and the clip goes, that was the product that opened up laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Lee Cohen, who championed the development of our trocar, the development of our clip applier, and it could have been one of those flyers that I took and failed, but it then doubled the size of the company and created the next level of massive growth. And it was all, because of her courage, her vision, and Mr. Hirsch's belief in her.
That's amazing. Yeah, and again, like so there's so many like stories like that. That's again why I do the shows, to hear them, and so I really appreciate you like sharing that because it's a tough question,
But the toughest, well, the warmest, most wonderful person, the toughest nails, was actually Turi Josephson, his wife. She's Norwegian. My mother was Norwegian. They actually were very good friends. And Turi was the one who championed education. That for me in 1993, to spend 6 weeks in a hotel to have laboratory, instrumentation, instructors. I was probably like $20,000 to train one rep at that time. There's not a lot of companies today who are paying $20,000 to go train a rep. Nevertheless, 20 years ago,
Right.
31 years ago, holy cow, and she got a lot of grief. Oh, because she's, Leon Hirsch's wife, and she was also beautiful, a beautiful, Norwegian woman, but she was so intelligent and she was so nails. And she stood up in an environment like that. And again, Mr. Hirsch was ahead of his time from a standpoint of, he was colorblind. He, no, not physically, but I mean, we
Oh,
had,
the hiring.
we
Yeah,
had,
yeah, I got it.
we
Yeah.
had people of color, of different race, ethnicity. It was not a petty racist environment. It was an environment of absolute killers.
And
And that people who survived were really good at what they did. And it didn't matter if they were man or woman. Now, again, people in the environment had all their different, at the times, have their own different biases. But he wanted execution, tempo, vision, accountability, excellence. And, whether you were from Brazil or whether you were African American or whether you were a woman or whether you're, Asian, if you took a picture of the management team, it was a collage. It was just the best of the best.
I want to reiterate that because that's what I read. And of course, when U.S. Surgical was operating, especially when he started the company, this was at a time when those things were, common. And if he was that way, nobody would blame him, right? Because it was just common back then. But he wasn't. And again, just for the audience who's like watching this on YouTube or Spotify, I just want to bring it up again.
Yeah.
If you look at this photo, I mean, you have a mix of people of like different ethnic backgrounds, both men and women. And that's kind of what stood out to me in this photo. Because again, like, I'll come back for a second. The political correctness and wokeness has gone like a little bit too far these days. But when I see a photo from a class of people from over a couple decades ago, and I see that level of diversity, like that kind of stood out to me right away. That's kind of part of the reason why I posted. I'm like, man, this is like a really diverse group of people, which I like. And again, like there's a lot to be said about diversity. Sometimes people don't take into account like diversity of thought, diversity of like economical backgrounds and everything. But yeah, and I think, I can't remember where I read it, but I read something about Mr. Hirsch where it was pretty much like he did not care who you were as long as you got things done.
That's it. Isn't that the greatest thing, the greatest diverse experiment being that everyone simply has a common goal and everyone is judged not on their skin color, their race, their religion, their sex. It's just their execution. If you create an environment where you can metric it well enough and you have, a blue enough ocean where people can go and manifest, and then when they succeed, you celebrate their success and they get paid and they succeed, and then you invest in them in their training when they can grow. Isn't that like the best, like diverse euphoria? Because there's no judgment on who you are. There's a judgment on what you do. And I'm telling you, with all sincerity, I've been through all different kinds of organizations. I love the man, but I love the man for a reason. And it's because he was just put his money where his mouth is. He took risks. He took flyers on people. And trust me, there were a lot of people that didn't deserve that trust. There were people who flamed out. There were people who who didn't have integrity, who took advantage of being in that type of environment because, there weren't a lot of guardrails in the environment either. We're running, but there also wasn't this compliance department. And this, it wasn't like, it had all of those guardrails and so he trusted in people and some people let him down. There's no doubt, but the environment was ripe for the best to be the best.
You have the choice to just hard pass on some of this stuff. But
oh boy, did I open the door?
Yeah. What I was going to ask though is that, all companies that are, that are not operating, like they sort of ran their path, and along the way they had their success. They also had their failures, right? And I'm not saying that towards the end of U.S. Surgical's time was a failure, but it's no longer around for various reasons. You start off in sales and marketing, and for the last 3 years, you were there as a VP and GM. And I think at some point in the early 2000s, US Surgical was acquired. Were there any lessons that you picked up as an observer during those years while you're there or afterwards as to maybe why that happened? Is there a scenario where US Surgical kind of could have kept going on, and not been acquired and sort of stayed as a standalone organization?
Of course, it could have kept going on. But I think, if I had to kind of identify like strategically where the biggest challenge was, we're competing against J&J. And I don't want to disparage J&J because it's an incredible organization for all the reasons.
But rivalries don't change, so feel free to like let Liz.
Oh, don't egg me on, because I'll pay for it.
Liz and your PR team is gonna be like, damn it, he's not going back on the show ever again.
I know. We had two businesses. We had what was called an endomechanical business, and then Ethicon had suture. Ethicon suture was a 90% market share product, 80% market share product. It was a virtual monopoly. The next largest suture company was Davis and Geck. They had very good cardiovascular sutures. US Surgical built itself on surgical stapling and laparoscopy, and the instrumentation was second to none. Ethicon had a research and duplication department. They copied every single thing unabashedly of US Surgicals, and we hated them for it. They were substandard, they were poor copies, but J&J was incredible at managing group contracts. They were incredible at leveraging their girth and their other businesses. And the one thing they started to do with all their hundreds of McKinsey consultants worked. And what it worked was they would bundle their suture business with their endomechanical business. The endomechanical business was, at that time, today it's world-class. So J&J had the world-class suture business, 80-90% market share. Only other company that would compete with it was Davis and Geck. Davis and Geck had been bought and sold multiple times and was very weak. And so J&J started to use the Ethicon endomechanical business, couldn't compete with surgical. They would duplicate products. At the times, the trocars leaked, the staples didn't properly form. It just wasn't a quality product yet. But they went for it, and they said, we're going to duplicate. This is a big business. We're going to duplicate what surgical has. And it wasn't about pride of ownership. It was about business. They then had a suture business that was, the best suture business out there, world-class, organic, incredible. And so they figured out that they can go to the large buying groups and they can give a big discount on the suture business if the hospital also bought their endomechanicals. And sometimes, because suture is used by every doctor in the hospital, cardiovascular, ophthalmics, all these expensive suture, endomechanical is really only the general surgeons. And so the power of their suture business was truly used to leverage against, in a very monopolistic way, right? You're taking a monopoly and you're saying that if you don't buy this substandard product, then it's going to cost you more money because I'm going to keep the prices very high on the monopoly. And Mr. Hirsch made a fateful decision one day that US Surgical was going to make its own suture. And it was going to make its own suture, and it was going to go and compete against this bundling. I think that was a fateful decision because the amount of R&D it took to organically create Dacron and polypropylene and nylon and all of these different things. It was just a massive investment, which took away from investing in other things. And it then validated J&J's strategy of bundling, because then we had to bundle. And of course, now we would bundle our endomechanical, which was just as world-class as Ethicon suture, but our suture couldn't get up to snuff. And you could say just as many bad things about our suture at the time as I'm saying about their endomechanical. And ultimately, it was a race to try to build up our weaknesses into our strengths, and then to go and bundle. That's when I think, US Surgical started to, lose its competitive edge, because we were in the best environments, you want to invest in your strengths. not your weaknesses. If you invest in your weaknesses, you're striving to become mediocre. But if you just say, look, I'm going to focus on my strengths and I'm going to do what no one else can do, and I'm going to be so far in front of everybody else, then you can maintain and you can go. But it was that environment. U.S. Surgical didn't do anything to hurt itself from not being able to sustain itself. If we stayed in our swim lane and we ignored that tactic from J&J, and we just were the best, surgical procedure company and focused on our devices and didn't go into the suture business, then I think surgical would still be around today. But that just drained the company. And then the groups loved to just bundle with J&J. And, a lot of those practices today, sole source agreements, and then, all or nothing market share shifts are no longer, almost permitted, or it's not a practice of the buying groups today. And actually, interestingly, in 2001, the Senate almost revoked an antitrust provision that allows buying groups to be paid by the vendors. I mean, they're paid by the vendors, they're not paid by the hospitals who they serve. They're actually paid by the vendors, and they have an antitrust exemption that allows them to be paid by a vendor, which would normally be a kickback. But because the buying groups were exerting so much pressure on a lot of smaller companies, the Senate had hearings about potentially revoking that antitrust exemption, and the buying groups were that close from being invalidated in the U.S. That's how much power they had. And at the time, J&J wielded it big time. That was, truthfully, that's what weakened U.S. Surgical. And I think Mr. Hirsch saw that. And I think when Tycho came knocking, he just realized that, he can't play this big group contract bundling game with J&J.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And just for the listeners, when you say buying groups, is that synonymous with like a GPO?
Uh-huh. Oh.
Got it. This is how you can tell I'm a startup guy, which is I've never dealt with, with GPOs as often. Maybe this is, I did a lot of capital equipment, but to this day, then those GPOs are paid by vendors.
It's the percentage of your contract participation. And so it'll be 1 or 2%. So if you're on contract, then you're agreeing to pay the fees. And so the vendor is paying the fees into the buying group, not the hospital. And then the hospital, based upon all the contracts, have incentives to drive compliance on these contracts. And so it's a whole kind of financial racket.
So I have no way of proving this, but again, being a unofficial historian, also just studying this is kind of what I think happened post U.S. Surgical. Are you familiar with the book Barbarians to Bureaucrats?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so it's a book about corporate life cycles, right? And actually, this will be good for the audience as well. Let me bring it up on screen. So these are essentially corporate life cycles where you start off as a prophet, which is more visionary, barbarian, which is leader of a crisis and conquest who commands a corporation to march towards rapid growth. And at some point when you grow as a huge company, you get to a point where it's mainly bureaucrats and aristocrats, and then you need to make change, right? So
Right.
I think U.S. Surgical in the building years of the 90s was full of barbarians, people who are aggressive, ready to just take over market, whatever it takes, etc. Right? And so I think they were transitioning, getting close to that builder and explorer phase where going to start building the company more with more portfolio products and everything, and then they had to exit. And so you have now this massive group of people who are, again, fit the barbarian profile, who were activated by what J&J did, right? And the thing that I love about our industry is that I don't see too many other industries that have just ruthless, brutal, bloodthirsty rivalries. And a good amount of those people left U.S. Surgical and went where? To Intuitive. At Intuitive, they absolutely cleaned the clock out of Ethicon, just brutalized them, just absolutely massacred them, and then did it again, which, by the way, I've mentioned this on my show, and some people get pissed, but it is true. When J&J acquired Oris, which was a great technology, but I think mismanaged it, and had a whole year head start ahead of Intuitive, and Intuitive with Ion came out and cleaned J&J's clock a second time. and I don't think that's by accident. And something that's, again, some people, they think I have like a love affair with intuitive. I have my own criticisms of intuitive, but you cannot deny the discipline of that organization and their execution, which, by the way, the foundation, just like a great pyramid, was started from US Surgical. Because today, and I always pull this up when I reference this because it keeps getting better, in some cases worse for others. Medtronic, with thousands of products, today's market cap, $111 billion. Stryker, with thousands of products, today's market cap, $134 billion. Intuitive, technically two products. Today's market cap is at $140 billion.
Unbelievable.
Uh-huh.
And it's also like I don't know, 5% of surgery.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there's 40 or 50 different robotics companies out there. I've been around a long time, and I've heard a bunch of different, scenarios and analogies. You're the first one who, and it was and for me at surgical, it's such a pleasing, concept that it didn't end there, but the legacy went to intuitive, and then that ultimately, succeeded and stands on top of the mountain. It's a lot of intuitive is also Lonnie Smith. Lonnie is an incredible man, incredibly disciplined, and he saw Jerry McNamara. He saw, and he constantly brought people from surgical because he saw these types of people and how good they were. But if Lonnie didn't have that vision, it wouldn't have come to pass. I don't know if are you familiar with computer motion?
Absolutely. And I saw you were present there. I wanted to bring that up. That was a fierce fight between computer motion too. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? And for the audience, for the young audience who, they don't know their history as well, tell us who is computer motion and what's their relation to intuitive.
So computer motion was the first surgical robot company. It was the first company that had a single robotic scope called ESOP that was a worldwide success. And then it had a robot called Zeus. It was founded by another legend, the father of robotics, actually Dr. Yulin Wang. And he, by 5 years before Intuitive was founded, computer motion had been developing a robot. Can we just keep going?
Oh yeah, keep going. No. I'll pay you a compliment. I say really, but like, you're the kind of guy, my friend, that I'll buy a drink and I just want to sit and listen to you tell these stories.
Come on. Well, there's a lot of stuff there, but computer motion was the first robotics company, but it didn't have the same tempo, energy. It was like the nicest guy in the world, and this was out of Santa Barbara, a lot of really cool people making really cool stuff. And one of the problems in robotics, just like in ultrasound that I'm doing today or others, is you can use a robot in cardiac surgery, orthopedic surgery, general surgery, OBGYN, pediatrics. Focusing and getting to that killer application is really, the hardest thing. When you have a product that can do anything and can work everywhere, you just got to say, I don't care. I'm going to focus on one thing that product does, and I'm going to move the needle to a standard of care. And once I do, then I'm going to go to the next opportunity and bring it to scale. There's this book called Crossing the Chasm. And Crossing the Chasm is that, there's that from innovators to adopters, there's a huge chasm in order to get to the early majority, to get to the real market. And you cross the chasm when you're able to change one thing that everyone does. And most companies, die in that chasm because they try to be everything. Well, computer motion was in that. They had the first voice control in the OR ever, called Hermes, the first scope, the first robot, and they were just trying to be everything to everybody. And I was at Surgical, and Tyco had acquired Surgical, which was a whole Kozlowski story. I can go on for a while there. After being there for 3 years, and then the whole, I had 10 years worth of equity that were vested. Probably, I don't know, worth a couple million dollars at the time in 2000, which was, whatever, one phone call away. sell, and it's in the bank. And the whole Tyco scandal hit with the shower curtain and the tax evasion and whatever. And within 3 days, 10 years worth of equity went to zero. I was close to the people over at Computer Motion, and I was really frustrated with the Tyco people and that whole dynamic. And so I left and I went to become president of Computer Motion. But before I got there, the company did 5.7 million of revenue in the first quarter of 2002. Second quarter of 2002, they did 5 million of revenue. Third quarter of 2002 is when I joined. They did 4.5 million in revenue. It's not a good trend line, but I also knew Intuitive's playbook. And in the fourth quarter of 2002, Computer Motion, my first full quarter, we did $8.7 million. And what we did was Computer Motion, Intuitive had done such a good job with radical prostatectomy that there was, and they had crossed the chasm. They had got to standard of care. They had, Manny Menon and Henry Ford Hospital, prospective randomized 5-year data that radical prostatectomy was significantly better than laparoscopic or open prostatectomy. And they were building a franchise. And Computer Motion, who never created a killer app, was trying to replicate what Intuitive was doing and was losing. In the fourth quarter of 2002, Intuitive tried to buy us because we had a patent lawsuit that was going on, and it was going to come to head in April of 2003. They offered us, at the time, if you took Computer Motion was public, if you took Computer Motion's market cap and Intuitive's market cap, it'd be a 90-10 split. And so they offered us a 50% premium. They said, Intuitive said, look, let's stop, fighting. Let's stop whatever. Let's put these companies together and create one robotics company. And we were like, screw that. We have a lot of momentum. 50% premium isn't enough. We can do a better job. And that was in the middle of the fourth quarter of 2002. So we closed the quarter. We do 8.7 million in revenue. Intuitive does 13.7 million in revenue. They missed their numbers for the first time to the street. And the reason why we closed a bunch of deals that they didn't close was because our device wasn't a radical prostatectomy device. Our device was 5 millimeter instruments. Theirs were 10. Ours had wrists that kind of moved in a small space. Intuitive's had elbows. They were like this. Ours were like this. Ours were attached to the table, which was so awesome. And to this day, I don't know why a robotics company isn't attached to the table. Because if when you're attached to the floor, if you move the patient, you got to take the instruments out. When you're attached to the table, you move with the patient and the arms move with the patient. And so what doctors would do, especially in general surgery, is that if they wanted to, operate on the, up on the above, in the chest cavity, or they want to operate by the diaphragm, say, then what they would do is they would do a Trendelenburg, which would elevate the head, and then have the bowel will then go down to the pelvis, opening up, like say if they wanted to do a gastric bypass, or they wanted to do a Nissen fundoplication by wrapping the esophagus. You can just elevate the table and all the bowel moves away. And you can do it and we had voice control. We would say Hermes, and it would go blink, like in Alexa, Hermes, blink, elevate the head or elevate the table, and it would automatically elevate. And our robot being attached by that, it was just awesome. So what I realized was we're not a urology company. Intuitive's wrists were so important because if you didn't have any laparoscopic skills, you could sit down at the robot and you can perform laparoscopic surgery. But with ours, we only had 6 degrees of freedom, not 7. It required a little more skill. But laparoscopic surgeons, they were operating on 2 degrees of freedom, a stick inside of a trocar. They didn't have these wrists. So if I give them 6 degrees, so we just said, okay, we're going to not sell into radical prostatectomy. We're going to focus on laparoscopy and pediatrics. And we closed a bunch of deals. And so we get to the end of 2002, we've blown out our numbers. Interesting, Bob Duggan, who's an interesting character, great guy, walks in my office, CEO, and he just throws down, 100,000 options and said, "You're the effing man," after we closed that quarter. So now we go into the first quarter of 2003, and we get a call from Lonnie Smith. We're two months away from a major patent litigation. We have momentum now. And I didn't realize at the time they hadn't closed any robots yet, and I'd closed two. But in February, we decided to meet with them, and and they made us an offer of 34% of the company. So a 66, 34 split, which just 3 months earlier was an 85-15 split. So computer motion shareholders today, I think Intuitive only did one secondary after that deal to raise some money. So that would have been only the dilution. But aside from whatever dilution, say that's brings them from 34 down to 30%. That means computer motion shareholders today own 30% of Intuitive.
Wow.
You want to talk about value creation at the time. And I remember J&J came in and they were looking at us. And I think our market cap might have been 60 million, 80 million or something. And, I think they were putting a price on it of 150 million. And J&J was like, oh, robotics are too expensive. That's too expensive for computer motion. And then they looked to go buy Intuitive. And Intuitive was always just too expensive to buy for J&J. And what an amazing mistake that was. Because, robotics turned into devices, turned into all different types of procedures. But, it was an amazing time to be able to have that front row seat. And probably the biggest career mistake I made in my life was Lonnie offered me to stay at Intuitive and be a VP of marketing. If I was his personal secretary, I would have made in 5 years a couple $100 million just because of all the equity I had. That then turned, today, if I stayed at Intuitive and just kept my stock, if they didn't pay me anything, I'd be probably a billionaire today. But anyways.
Yeah, but then if that would have happened, you may not have continued working,
Well, I have to work because I haven't had the Alex Sukic like home run or the Todd Podokar home run or the big guys.
Why did you, if you go back, and this, I don't know if you've thought about this. I'm sure you did, but like it's been a while. But when that happened, afterwards you went on to be a CEO of Rita Medical Systems. Is the reason why you didn't do that because the idea that early in your career, like you're downgrading from at this point you were a president for a year, had these phenomenal results, and to downgrade from that to a VP of marketing at a company that it wasn't really clear what their future is going to be? Was that kind of the reason?
No, that wasn't the reason. I was too emotional. I got caught up. I was emotional about U.S. Surgical and J&J. I was emotional about Tyco buying U.S. Surgical, and I was emotional about the fight that computer motion and Intuitive had. And I was kind of blinded at the time because it was. I mean, competing against Jerry McNamara. Are you kidding me? And those people, it was bloody.
Bad.
And not in a bad way, not in an unethical way. It was just bloody.
Just insane and brutal competition.
It was insane. I mean, that competition between computer motion and Intuitive was insane. And I just fell in love with computer motion. And when Intuitive bought computer motion, they just shut the whole thing down. All the products that you saw at Computer Motion were just mothballed. All the customers that had bought Computer Motion products either had to buy Intuitive or get out of robotics. It was a scorched earth, complete evaporation. It was not an acquisition and merger. It was buy it, kill it. And then, they'd have all the intellectual property that would create basically a moat for the next 20 years. So I was very emotional about that.
Understandably so, too.
And I just had, and then carrying what for me was the enemy's flag. Like if it was like a real integration and there was parts of the business that would survive but that was my mistake. If I was intelligent, I'd realize that these guys had the best product and the best team, and they were the winners, and they're asking me to join the winning team. But I was so emotional about computer motion, the people, the customers, what we were doing. And I just didn't think it was right to just shut everything down. And I just had a hard time just changing colors and getting on the other side. And I regret it. If I was intelligent, I would realize, that that's just, it's like, I don't know, it's like Michigan, Ohio State. You can say, okay, would you transfer to the other school and go wear their colors and go win a bunch of national championships? I, I just, I was emotional, and I couldn't get past. They were wonderful to me. Lonnie was wonderful. Jerry was wonderful. Alex was wonderful. They wanted me to stay, and I messed up.
I don't blame you. I don't think many people would have done anything differently. But one thing I want to just I don't want to hear myself speak, but I want to point something out because it's a theme, and I think it's some like this has to be like documented and spoken about. And I'm just going to say this is like allegedly this is purely my interpretation, and so I could be wrong about this. So hopefully that just absolves me legally. I don't think legally this can get me in trouble, but what happened with J&J and the Oris acquisition, I think it's similar to what happened with computer motion and intuitive in a different sense, in that J&J needed a robotics program. They acquired Oris, which is a phenomenal system, in my opinion, the better technology, because I've driven both the Ion and the Monarch. And at the same time, J&J also acquired their, Google Venture partnership, which was Verb Surgical. And Verb and Oris were competing very competitively, neck and neck, very intensely, right? And they're both in Silicon Valley and everything. And I think where the management made a mistake, and I think this is the lesson for like M&A moving forward in our industry. If you buy the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees, and you are going to combine the teams, you don't torch one team's jerseys and say, hey guys, between the two of you, the Yankees have won more championships, so you're all going to go wear the Yankee jersey. And I think that's the mistake they made. I think what should have happened was they torched both teams, aka Oris and Verb, and say, hey, we're starting a completely new company, new team, new jersey, new colors. Who wants to play for it? Because that's not what happened. Again, I know this just because when that happened, I didn't see the Verb, logo ever again, but I saw the Oris robot and logo, and everything stayed the same. I think that was where it was sort of the beginning of the end. I don't know. I could be wrong about that.
I don't have any inside knowledge of Oris and J&J and whatnot. Although a dear friend of mine, a U.S. surgical guy, Kurt Azabarzin, did go work for J&J for a while for the robotics program. So I know some. He did take the photo. Yeah, that's my brother. He's unbelievable. I don't think culture, you've heard the phrase that, culture will eat strategy, for lunch. Culture's everything. Because it's just the bond that keeps everyone together. And when you destroy a culture that, people had built over time, it's an artifact. It's an artifact of an acquisition. If you pay that kind of money, it's yours, and you can do whatever the hell you want with it. You can't sell something and tell the buyer what to do with it, right? Buyer owns it, but it's not a good strategy if you valued an asset at a certain place to go in and completely destroy that culture, or because you're just going to destroy the value of that asset. You have to find, a happy medium. You have to take, the best people of what you bought, and then you got to teach them your culture, and you got to respect theirs, but then indoctrinate them in yours. And that's how you do it. And I don't know what the example is with Oris and J&J, but if that's what happened, then that, obviously that's a mistake, but it's definitely what happened with computer motion. And that's why I didn't stay.
Yeah. And again, like I can't blame you. I mean, I'm sure there are others, and I may not, I'm not doing it any service by not remembering or thinking of any, but probably the only transformational acquisition. And for the audience, that, something that's over $1 billion, the only transformational acquisition that I've personally seen in the last decade of a single like product, by the way, because like the Medtronic Covidien acquisition worked really well, but that's like multiple products. The only good single acquisition I've seen that was very messy at the beginning, but they made it work is when Stryker acquired Mako. That's the only one
Oh
I've
my
seen
God.
go really well.
Well, I mean, Maurice and Mako was a great company, and probably the best medical device CEO in the industry is Kevin Lobo. And just think about the balls on that guy. Here's a guy who becomes CEO of Stryker, and then he pays $1.8 billion for a company, I think that had barely 150 million of revenue or some sort.
Yep.
And he's being, initially just tarred and feathered for how can you make, this is first of all Stryker, and then you have Kevin, but it wasn't about the robot. It was about selling more knees. Very simple. It was never about, the robot was a facilitator to drive market share, to create differentiation. When I was at Smith and Nephew, we had a 30-year knee. We had a bearing surface that had a bearing surface for an axinium for the femoral, and then a cross-linked poly for the base plate. And we did a test, and we received an FDA approval for that it would last 30 years under normal conditions. And we started marketing it. We had advertising, and within 1 year, we converted 894 surgeons over to our knee because patients were asking for the 30-year knee. And then Stryker started to advertise their roundabout knee, and it's all about knee market share. And what Kevin did with Mako was brilliant. Maurice built a beautiful company that was worth it, and Kevin had the greatest courage to do that deal, and it's paid off in spades. I love that guy. I admire him, and that was a great, great deal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's somebody for episode 100, he was supposed to be our guest because the audience demanded it. But unfortunately, we couldn't work it out with his PR and marketing team. But I'm holding out hope we'll get him and everything. Yeah,
It'll be worthwhile.
100%. But Joe, look, I want to be respectful of your time, and I can't tell you how grateful I am that, on a Friday and of all the things you could be doing, you spend, a couple hours with us on this show, and definitely want to have you back. There's a lot to talk about in terms of Butterfly, partnership you have with Mandera, which is really exciting. But just a quick side note, like talking about people of the newer generation who are cut from that same cloth at US Surgical, Josh Stefanzo, he's that guy.
He's a badass. He is that guy.
Yeah, his episode's releasing next week,
Oh yeah,
So
that's cool.
yeah, he's a fantastic guy. But Joe, I appreciate it. And where can people find you online? You're active on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah, that's probably where I'm most active.
We'll have people reach out to you and just connect and follow there. Well, that's been another episode of the State of MedTech. I want to remind the audience, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the show. Do us a favor, give it 5 stars, write a review. We're in the healthcare category. I'm coming for Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia. We want to make this show the number 1 spot. So awesome. Take care, everybody, and have a great evening.